This hour on I-24 News. Iran is threatening to step up its ballistic missile program despite warnings from the Trump administration. The announcement comes less than a week after President Trump refused to recertify the Iran nuclear deal.
In Israel, more than 100 people were detained as ultra-Orthodox Jews held a day of rage. Their anger was fueled by efforts to force them to enlist in the Israeli military.
And outrage at the University of Florida. A speech by white nationalist Richard Spencer sparked protests, and when he tried to speak, he was heckled.
We are stronger than you, and you'll know it. That's why you're hanging up there like some kind of wall.
From the I-24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Shuster and Michelle Malkori.
Good evening. Thanks for watching. From Washington to Tehran, tensions are rising and patience is wearing thin. A day after the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, urged for a tighter grip on Iran's weapon development programs, Iran is refusing to back down.
Iran is now threatening to expand its missile program. I-24 News defense correspondent Daniel Tzemach has more.
A war of words between two countries, and it's showing no signs of stopping. On Thursday was Iran took aim at the U.S. with a vow from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Iran's ballistic missile program will expand, and it will continue with more speed in reaction to President Donald Trump's hostile approach towards this revolutionary organization.
Trump's approach calls for greater limitations on Iran's missile program. Iran's latest blast comes less than a week after the U.S. president urged action against the Islamic Republic and a total reevaluation of the nuclear deal.
There are sanctions outside the Iran deal that target the regime's ballistic missile program in support for terrorism and all of its destructive activities.
One important detail, the nuclear deal signed with Iran does not actually limit the ballistic missile program at all. A UN Security Council resolution from 2015 does, or at least is meant to. The language of the text is rather soft, merely calling on Iran to halt development, but hardly demanding that it does so. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, echoed Trump's sentiment at a Security Council meeting on Wednesday, adding,
"When a rogue regime starts down the path of ballistic missiles, it tells us that we will soon have another North Korea on our hands."
Only a month ago, Iranian media released a video of an allegedly successful missile test launch. But various media reports later stated that the test launch was actually a fake and that the video was several months old. One constant in Iran's behavior has been a tendency to push the envelope. The question is, how far are they willing to go? Daniel Tzemach, I-24 News.
For more, let's bring in our panel, and we're joined by Matthew Brodsky, Senior Fellow at the Security Studies Group. Also with us, our Senior Diplomatic Correspondent, Nina Larsen at the United Nations, and our Senior Washington Correspondent, Dan Raviv. Thank you all. And Matthew, I'd like to start with you. Is this move by Iran in any way a reaction to what President Trump has said with regarding to not recertifying the Iran deal, or is this something that Iran would be doing regardless?
Well, I think they'd be doing it regardless. I think also they look at the North Korean example and they learned that it's you can probably have some good fun poking the president and watching him have a reaction to it. Now, they were going to continue with the ballistic missile program. It's probably not the smartest move for Iran to be flouting it. But, I mean, the bottom line is this was the problem with the deal to begin with. We've capped off their uranium production, but the other two aspects of creating a nuclear weapon, the weaponization programs that go on at their military facilities, we can't verify, and their ballistic missiles aren't in the deal. And as you saw, the wording in the UN resolution, it's toothless.
Dan Raviv, you attended an event today where there were public remarks from the CIA Director Mike Pompeo and President Trump's National Security Advisor General McMaster. What did they say about Iran, and what did you pick up?
What I was struck by, David, is that they feel that the speech by President Trump this past Friday was a watershed event. He wasn't just decertifying the nuclear deal, refusing to report to Congress that Iran is abiding by the precise steps that are in that deal from 2015. But beyond that, the president was outlining a much tougher strategy against what Iran does in the region and indeed the world. And so they advised us, I mean, both these officials, it was Mike Pompeo, the CIA director under Trump, and H.R. McMaster, the general who is Trump's national security advisor. They advised us to read the Trump speech again, take a look at it, see some of the aspects that perhaps weren't sufficiently covered, almost as though the United States is declaring war, at least to a degree, at least verbally, on the activities of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Iranian regime, as these two officials put it, and how they treat the Iranian people. It was a very broad attack, and they said that that's how President Trump feels about it. They both said that the president, when he talks about world affairs and issues such as Iran, he asks a lot of questions and then he decides. They were trying to make their boss sound brilliant, of course, but at the very least, they certainly were describing a man who is decisive. David and Michelle?
And Nina, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, as we heard from Dan, was speaking today. And one of the comments that he made was he was expressing concern about the exchange of nuclear technology between Iran and North Korea, saying that that was a major danger, particularly with regards to nuclear weapons. Is this a concern shared by other countries, the cooperation between North Korea and Iran? And is this a concern that has been mentioned by the United Nations?
Not in recent days and weeks, Michelle. It is something that people have been aware of. There's always been this suspected very close relationship between the two rogue regimes, but it's not something that's been on the table here at the UN. A recent development, I must mention, though, is that the EU is showing great resistance to any tampering with the Iran deal. We had a joint statement from every EU leader today. That's 28 countries. They were all meeting in Brussels at a summit, and they came out in support of that deal. And they also said that these economic interests that Iran has started to develop with European countries absolutely must stay in place. However, a bit of support from the French president, for President Trump, perhaps. He was hosting the IAEA Secretary General, and that's the nuclear watchdog for the United Nations, and they keep a very close eye on what the Iran nuclear program is doing. They really are in charge of real compliance. But Macron said that the IAEA must be extra stringent. So perhaps there's been some phone calls behind the scenes on that, a little bit of support from France. But looking at the entirety of the EU, they're still backing that deal.
So, Matthew Brodsky, given the way the Europeans feel, given that Iran's supreme leader has said they will shred the nuclear deal if the United States backs out, has President Trump now backed himself into a corner by saying that if Congress and the international community doesn't come up with some sort of change, that the United States will get rid of this thing, and that will give a green light to Iran to restart their nukes?
Well, I wouldn't say he's backed himself into a corner as much as he's put himself exactly where he needs to position himself and the country. I mean, the deal as it is just doesn't work. It puts Iran on a glide path, so it needs to change, and it needs to change in the area.
Let me stop right there, because there are a number of people, including the people who agreed on this deal, including the Obama administration, Secretary of State John Kerry and others, who say, well, wait a second, if you go to war with Iran to knock out their nuclear program, even the best experts say, okay, maybe you delay their nuclear program by 3 years. At least for the next 8 years, you've put a freeze on Iran spinning centrifuges and enriching uranium. Why isn't that something to be, I don't know, held up as valuable?
Okay, so then that's actually a different case. Then you can make the argument that it's good to stay in the nuclear deal until the sunset clauses start kicking in. The problem there, and of course, be renegotiating the deal along the way. But the problem there is, again, as I've said before, we have a cap on the nuclear part, on the enrichment of uranium and plutonium. But when it comes to the missile production, advancements in that technology, and the weaponization process, that continues apace. So it literally is shrinking down whatever is the breakout time, which is supposed to be kept to a year. The further along this deal goes, the more that shrinks. So you can make the case perhaps that you have more time to negotiate a better deal. But the fact remains, if we don't get a better deal, then there's no reason to remain in it from America's
Well, just to be clear, because I think some of our viewers may be confused, there are two aspects to this. There is, of course, the nuclear facility, which can essentially enrich uranium and produce the device. And then there's the platform that it would be carried on, the missiles. The argument has been, though, that, well, Iran is going to develop those missiles anyway. They were making progress. That wasn't the threat to a lot of the countries in the region. The threat was the actual use of a nuclear weapon.
Well, I mean, tell that to anyone in Southeast Asia who's looking at North Korea launch ballistic missiles over their heads, and tell that to Guam. I mean, it's the ballistic missiles of that nature are meant to carry a nuclear payload. Otherwise, what's the point? You don't spend that much and invest that much of a country's fortunes into developing something that's going to, deliver the firepower of a.
Well, that's a great point, but the fact is that the United States has Iran locked up on the nuclear side of this for the next 8 years in a way that they don't have with North Korea. But Dan Raviv, to Matt's point, there are those in Washington who say, look, this deal is eventually going to have to change. Why not deal with this now?
Well, David, it always falls to somebody to defend the nuclear deal that was reached by 6 countries on one side, not just the United States, not just the Obama administration, and Iran on the other side. So, David, it's your night. You were defending the deal. Of course, I have heard from Obama administration officials who are now basically retired or at think tanks that the deal is working, that, in fact, the president could have certified that it continues to work, that Iran is obeying the deal when it comes to the military sites that seem to be beyond inspection. If there is a specific suspicion about that, then Iran does have to open them up. Apparently, that hasn't happened yet. I did hear from the Trump administration officials today sort of admitting that there's been a little bit more visibility than there was without the Iran nuclear deal. We are getting more information on what Iran had, and indeed, they have frozen their nuclear program. But considering what Iran is really like, this is the way they put it. The Obama administration was hoping and dreaming, almost talking to itself, that Iran's behavior would improve and Iran would become a nice member of the family of nations if the nuclear deal was reached. Well, it turns out, according to the Trump administration officials, Iran is still an evil country.
Dan Raviv, appreciate it. Thank you so much. Matthew Brodsky and Nina Larsen, thanks.
Just ahead, a speech by a white nationalist.